Well, okay. And thinking about what I was going to teach this morning, and it really didn't fix in me until last night after our meeting together. So sometimes the Spirit just tells us at the last minute what we're going to talk about. But it's not really new what I'm going to say. Louis said many of the things that we'll talk about, and so it's an old message, but and it's rooted in my own experience as well. I thought I would start out by talking about how in previous years I've had the 3 bottles up on the stage and filled with different colored liquids and the eggs in the bag, and I may do that the next time I teach, but I thought that, well, before I can discuss how God delivers us, I have to discuss what went wrong. What is wrong with us? Why are we sinners? And then even before that, I have to go back, well, this really goes back to God himself and the freedom of God himself to choose what kind of God that he is. And a lot of Christians don't really think about that. They just think, well, God is perfect. God just is the way he is. He's always been the way he is. And that always bothered me, because if God just is the way he is and didn't choose to be the kind of God he is, then, well, how's that different from being an animal that acts on instinct? And I don't want to reduce God to the level of instinct. If human beings have freedom at some level, then God has freedom. God is freedom at some level. And so God chooses to be the kind of God that he is. It says in 1 John chapter 4 that God is love. He doesn't say God has love. He doesn't say God is loving. He doesn't say God's character is full of love. No, he identifies God with a certain kind of love, agape love, that self-sacrificial love demonstrated by Jesus on the cross dying for us, that he would sacrifice everything for our sake. And so that this is the kind of God that he is. But if he always just was that way, because that's the definition of perfection, God is perfect, so he must always be that way, well then, how is that different from an animal? That just makes it instinctual rather than a choice. There's always, to me, something that I've chosen, and ultimately something God has chosen, is always worth more than just something you do because you can't help doing it. If you just can't help doing it, it's like, well, what worthiness is there to that? Revelation 4 and 5 talks about worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Well, if he couldn't help doing it, how is that worthy of worship? Because that's what worship means, is the worthship. I recognize the worthship of God. And if he just couldn't help it, well, there's no value to that, really. And I hate saying that about Jesus, the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. It's like, of course he's worthy. Of course that's the infinite worth of the Lamb slain. So I want to return back to what Norman Grubb usually started when he talked, and that is one person in the universe, because it really begins there. And, well, how do we, that's strange. Well, aren't we all persons? Aren't there 8 billion persons on the earth alive today? Maybe 30, 40 billion persons who've lived in history. How can we say that God is the one person in the universe? Well, God created us to be a family of sons. So he's created us to reflect his image, to be his images in the world. And Louis rightly brought that up, that an image is an idol, and that we were God's idols. We are to be the physical manifestation of God in this universe, in this world. Wow. And in fact, actually, there was a ritual that was performed by all the idolatrous nations around Israel that when they made an idol, it wasn't just a piece of stone or a piece of gold or a piece of wood, but a ritual of, it was called breathing into the mouth. That they breathe, that the god would breathe into the mouth of the idol, and so the presence of the god was within the idol. And so to be the idol of God is to be filled with the spirit of that God. You were the living manifestation, just as the idol was the living manifestation of the deity in the temple. So the basic idea is that the idol, or in this case the human being, was to be a vessel of deity, a vessel expressing the will, representing the deity in this world. It's such an exalted role that was given to humanity. But of course, Satan tricked us and thought, no, that's not good enough. We want to be our own persons. We were just meant to be derivative persons, persons containing the person. Because in order to contain the person, to express the person, we had to be derivative persons who were capable of containing the person. So he's the one person in the universe, and he wanted to express himself in many human forms, many bodily forms. But he couldn't. He couldn't because Adam and Eve made a choice, and they made a choice to believe the wrong spirit. And in fact, while there's one person in the universe, there are two spirits, two deity natures, Norman called them, because one of Norman's main themes, and I think it's just simply the Bible, there's no real such thing as a human spiritual nature. Now, of course, we could talk about human nature like, okay, I have a body, soul, and spirit, and I have a personality, and we talk about human nature on that level. Of course that exists. But my humanity is designed to express God's spirit nature, who God has chosen to be. And we're going to get to what God has chosen to be in a moment. But unfortunately, we became expressors of the other spirit nature, because there's two spirit natures. There is a passage in Hebrews 1:9, a prophecy of Jesus from Psalm 45:7, and let me read that. Let me turn there. Hebrews, I'll start with verse 8. But of the Son, the eternal Son of God, he says, your throne, O God, calls him God, is forever and ever. The scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. So he's called God, and yet God, your God. The Father has anointed him. And because he has loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Well, there are the two natures, the two spirits, the spirit of righteousness and the spirit of wickedness. And the Lamb has chosen to be righteousness from the foundation of the world. If we look at Revelation 13:8, it says, everyone whose name has not been written in the book of the life of the Lamb who was slain from before the foundation of the world. Well, I thought the Lamb was slain on the cross 2,000 years ago. But yet here it says he was slain from before the foundation of the world. Well, how is that? How is the cross a principle in the heart of God? Well, that's because God made a fundamental choice in eternity to be one thing and not the other, to be righteousness and not wickedness, to be love of that self-sacrificial love for others in eternity, and not the self-for-self seeking for power and seeking to be above others and to put others down. And ultimately, what happened is that Satan opened up the other alternative. You see, the other alternative was a possibility that existed within God that God forever denied to himself. That's why Scripture says about God in Hebrews, and also I think in 1 or 2 Timothy says that God cannot lie. Well, of course, God can do all things. He's omnipotent and sovereign, so why wouldn't he be able to lie? Why would he not be able to? And really, to lie is to break your word, to break a promise. Why is it that God can't lie? Because he's fixed himself in righteousness. He's fixed himself to be an other lover. He's fixed himself to be self-sacrificial love, to be the slain lamb from eternity. He can't be otherwise. That's who God has chosen to be in his freedom. And in his freedom, he chose to be one and not the other. But that didn't mean the other possibility ceased to exist. It didn't exist in actuality yet. But then the false angel, Satan, opened that possibility up and chose to be it. I'd like to look at a couple scriptures that talk about that. And the first is Isaiah 14. And here he says, he's talking about the king of Babylon, but the king of Babylon is really a form of Satan. And so he says, and it's obvious he's talking about someone more or greater than a mere human king. And he says, how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn, morning star. How you are cut to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. And so you hear repeatedly in this, I will ascend to heaven. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly. The Mount of Assembly is the mountain on which the gods were assembled and formed a council. What Satan is declaring here is, I'm going to be chief among the gods. I'm going to take God's place. I'm going to be like the Most High. In other words, I'm going to replace the Most High. And the reason he wanted that is I believe, is that he despised God for choosing to be the slain lamb. He thought God was weak, that the choice to be self-sacrificial love was weakness. And that's why 1 Corinthians 1 talks about the wisdom of God as it is more powerful than the foolishness of men, and that the weakness of God, amazing statement, is more powerful than the strength of men. So, that Satan, that spirit, despised. And so he chose to be the god of power, the god of wrath, the god of tyranny, the god of domination over others. And it was the origin and the manifestation of this false wisdom in Satan. Satan himself, though, is really a vessel. We talk about being vessels of Christ or vessels of Satan, but Satan himself is a vessel of this false possibility that he opened up that God forever denied. It isn't that there's any darkness in God. It was a possibility, a potential. It wasn't an actuality in God. It wasn't real darkness in God, because God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all, 1 John chapter 1. So it wasn't real darkness until Satan opened it up and began expressing it. And that's why Norman talked about these two natures as deity natures. And, is Satan a deity? Well, Satan's called the god of this age in 2 Corinthians 4:4. So, and he talks about the gods, the council of the gods, the assembly of the gods throughout the Old Testament. And Christians tend to ignore that. They don't think about the divine council. And if you've ever read Michael Heiser, he goes into detail about that. But it's very important to realize God is the supreme deity over a council of angels who can be called Elohim, or gods. And the gods of the nations are these fallen angels, these fallen gods, so to speak, Elohim, who were given rulership over the nations after the Tower of Babel. But Satan was even more powerful than any of these angels. He was the chief of the angels and fell. But he chose that spirit of self-assertion and chose to become the expresser of that. And I'd like to turn to another passage about Satan, Ezekiel 28. And it's talking here about the king of Tyre. But the king of Tyre is, which was a Phoenician Canaanite city to the north of Israel, now in the country of Lebanon on the coast. But it says things about this person here that could not possibly be true of the king of Tyre. So he's talking about a spirit that fills the king of Tyre. Ezekiel 28:12. Son of man, talking to Ezekiel, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre and say to him, thus says the Lord God, you were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Well, I know no king that was like that, but so it's obviously, this is the angel, Satan, before he fell. You were in Eden, the garden of God. The king of Tyre was never in Eden. This is who was in Eden? Well, there was Adam and there was Satan, the serpent. And I think here it's the serpent, because he goes on to talk about the being here as a guardian cherub. And the cherubs are the four living creatures that guard the throne of God. And Satan was one of them. So you were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. Sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle, crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. On that day that you were created, they were prepared. So all these gemstones just illustrate the exalted status of this spirit. And it's his exaltation that became his downfall. Just as, our strengths, supposedly, they become our greatest weakness. Well, and he says, verse 14, you were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. The mountain of God goes from the earth and ascends into the heavens. The clouds, the top of the mountain is in the heavenly presence of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created. It wasn't God's fault that Satan ended up the way he was. Till unrighteousness was found in you. Well, how did that unrighteousness get in him? Because God had chosen, the Son had chosen righteousness and had hated wickedness. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, within you, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. You see, Satan took his eyes off the Son of God, and he turned and looked at himself. And he didn't see a reflection of the glory of God. What he saw was himself and his own beauty and his own wisdom. And so Martin Luther talked about sin as turning inward on yourself, looking away from the Son of God and looking at yourself, being curved inward. And that's exactly what Satan did. And so Satan was cast to the ground and exposed before kings to feast their eyes on you. And all who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You have come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever. And that's the ultimate destiny of Satan that hasn't happened yet. But still, your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. He exchanged the wisdom of God for the false wisdom of the other spirit. So this is what Satan did before Adam ever showed up in the garden. Satan corrupted himself. And this was the alternative that God rejected. So when Adam shows up in the garden, Adam is faced with the same choice that we are in Genesis 3. He's placed in a garden with two trees, and God places the two trees there. Satan doesn't invent anything. Satan is not a creator. He can only corrupt. He cannot create. And so God meant for humanity to make the same choice that he himself had made, that Satan had made, and choose between righteousness and wickedness. So then why doesn't he just call the tree of evil? Or why doesn't he just call it the tree of falsehood? Now, I think God just picked a tree, probably a fig tree, because they cover themselves with fig leaves afterwards. I don't believe it was an apple, because apples don't grow in Mesopotamia, where Eden likely was. But anyway, not that that's really important. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the tree. Knowledge of good and evil in Hebrew means knowing right from wrong. And so it would be the tree, whatever Adam chose, he would know right and wrong. But who's right and wrong? Whose wisdom would he choose? In Judges, it says about Israel, and Israel during the time of the Judges was not following God, is that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Their own independent understanding or wisdom regarding good and evil, that they didn't follow God's understanding of good and evil, they followed their own, which really means Satan's, because Satan is really the god of self. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will be better than other people. I will decide for myself what is good and what is evil, and everything is decided in reference to myself. If it makes me feel bad, it's evil. If it makes me feel good, it's good. If I get what I want, it's good. If I don't get what I want, then it's evil, and I'm full of wrath, because Satan is the god of wrath. In fact, actually, I think I was reading from Ezekiel, and it says that God brought fire in verse 18, Ezekiel 28:18. I brought fire from your midst, from within you, and it consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth in the sight of all who saw you. So Satan is a spirit filled with wrath because God is determined. He delivered the whole creation, including the angelic creation, over to futility or vanity in Romans 8, and ultimately determined that that self for self would never get what it wanted and would never be satisfied. So the spirit of Satan is a spirit of covetousness, of constant unsatisfied desire, so that you never fully get everything you want, and you're always angry, always full of wrath, always full of fear that you're not going to get what you want, full of self for self. There can be no rest for, as it says throughout the Psalms, there is no rest for the wicked, because this very spirit within them is a spirit that is never satisfied, constant covetousness. So I'd like to turn here, before I go on, and just talk about my own experience of what I was like before I was saved. And when I was a young child, I was about 6.5 years old when my younger brother was born. And the night he was born, I dreamed that he died. And I went down and I told my aunt this, the day he was born, that I had dreamed he died. I did not want a younger brother. I was very used to being my mother's favorite child, and I did not want a replacement. And so at 6.5, I was already a murderer, and the desire for something, in a way, is the same as actually doing it. Even though I never actually killed my younger brother, I wanted him dead in my heart. My older brother wanted the same thing when I was young, and he pushed me down the cellar stairs when I was 1.5, and I still have a scar to show it. He tried to off me. And so I very much identify with the story of Jacob and Esau and these brothers fighting in the womb, because that's been my relationship with my brothers throughout my life, really, has been this competitive rivalry and not getting what I want. And so I knew I was a murderer at some level. I also knew I was a thief. I remember we went down to this secondhand shop, and I collected stamps. I saw some stamps that I wanted, and my mother wouldn't buy them, so I shoplifted. I took the stamps. It was only about $1 or $2 for the stamps, but I was a thief. It didn't matter. It could have been $1 million, or it was really just $1. I was probably 8 years old at the time. My mother caught me when we got home, and I think maybe she returned them to the store. And then another example was when I probably was 10, and also because of stamps, I took $10 from my mother's purse, and my mother's very upset. She needed that money for groceries. Of course, I didn't admit it, so I was a liar, too. So I was a murderer, a thief, and a liar. You read the Gospel of John 8:44, for example. It says here, John 8:44, "You are of your father the devil, and his desires you do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he tells a lie, he speaks from his own nature, because he is a liar and the father of lies." So I knew, and it also says that it calls Satan a thief, and Jesus calls him a thief in John 10. He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And so, well, that's what I did. By the age 10, I was a thief, a liar, and a murderer, and I knew it. And one of the things of my childhood was also that my father, he really was incapable of loving me. And I knew that he didn't love me. In fact, I knew that he despised me. And that when I was born, I was jaundiced, and I was born with a head of black hair, and I looked nothing like him. And I think I was rejected from the time I was born. And I'm not trying to make a victim of myself here, but I knew I was hated. And also whenever any of us three boys got into trouble, I would just sort of fall apart. Crying, or it just, I had no strength in me to fight back, and so my father despised me because that was weakness to him, because he despised it in himself. That he was bullied by a girl when he was born, and his mother locked the door out and wanted him to fight his own battles, and so he hid under the porch for hours to escape this girl, and so he despised himself. And I represented everything that my father despised about himself and hated about himself. And so my point in this is not for people to feel sorry for me, but that I wanted something from my father that I couldn't have, his love. I wanted him to value me. I wanted him to care about me, normal human desires. And so at one point, I broke into his coin collection. I took some of his coins for myself. And I didn't really know about it, but, there was an incident where my father flew into a rage, and he had a major problem with rage. When he was a child, and his sisters took his pennies that he had collected and spent them. And they actually, because of my father's rage, had to send him to a camp in Arizona for several years to get him away from my sisters. He was so full of rage and wrath. And of course, taking his coins, that just brought up all that wrath. And my mother told me, go out in the woods behind our house and hide for a couple hours. My father was so full of rage. Once he came after me with a knife. I thought I was going to die, and my mother put herself in between me and my father. And I always knew my mother loved me, at least on a human level. But, all this to bring up that my father's wrath, and then I kept doing things that would provoke his wrath, and I couldn't stop doing it. And around this time, I was given a copy of the Gospels by a pastor tearing down a building a building near our house, and I read the Sermon on the Mount. And so that was my first encounter with God's law and of who God was. And, I just believed them because, I'm still a child. It's like, oh, yeah, I didn't understand about Jesus dying on the cross for my sins or anything, but I knew what the way to be was. And that was important, because when I realized that I was doing these things that I couldn't control myself and stop myself from provoking my Father to wrath, God gave me a picture in my mind that I was chained to Satan in my heart. This was even before I had really understood the gospel, and no one had ever preached it. I had never been to church. All I'd done is maybe read some of the gospels, and it just was a very powerful image, this dark figure that I was chained in these thick chains, like sometimes you see pit bulls chained to a stake in the yard with these half-inch thick chains. I think it's abusive, but that's the image, that there was no possibility I could break myself from that. And so, about my despair and agony got so great, and I just became full of wrath and anger myself. The same wrath and anger that was in my father. He had just passed it on to me. It was the same spirit that had been passed on to me. And I knew that he was chained to the devil in his heart. And how was I going to be delivered? And I even, when I hear stories of people just going into a rage and going to a mall and killing 20, 30 people, I think, I could have done that. I hate it when the news portrays it, how he was mentally ill, and we're not like him. We're the nice people. That's some bad people that was acting out of mental illness. No, I'm here to tell you that each and every one of you and every human being could do that, is capable of it. That if we didn't do it, as my friend Brian Coatney says, we either didn't get around to it yet, or Satan didn't do it for whatever reason yet, or God kept us from doing it. It was not because of my superior righteousness that I didn't do it, but I knew I was capable, and I knew at some level that the answer was the cross. I didn't understand the cross, but I knew that that was the answer. That was divine revelation too. God was leading me through all this, even in the darkness of my consciousness. And so I decided, I needed to be baptized, and I thought the Catholic Church is the oldest church, so I told my mother I wanted to join the Catholic Church. And so she contacted a neighbor just across from us who was Irish, and she had immigrated from Ireland. And, it turned out, actually, she was going to a Pentecostal church, and she was a born-again Christian. She wasn't Catholic at all. So she sent over a testimony of Larry Tomczak, Clap Your Hands, which is about a Catholic who became a Christian, and it described how he came to Christ and the Romans Road. And I just believed when I read what he said. It just was, it just fit with what God had been revealed to me. And so I accepted Christ apart from going to a Catholic wedding when I was in second grade. My second grade teacher was getting married. I had never set foot inside a church apart from that. I'd never heard a preacher tell me the gospel. I had to read it. And I'm not sure I would have listened to a preacher. We did have other neighbors that were born-again Christians, but I always thought they were sort of strange, and they gave you apples and popcorn for Halloween rather than candy, so nobody wanted to go to their house. But anyway, this neighbor who gave me this book, I went over and talked to her, and she became a kind of surrogate mother for me. I think my mother was jealous to some degree. I'd go over almost every afternoon and talk, and she led me in my early stages of being a Christian during high school. And, I was not well socialized. I was a loner. I really didn't have friends in school. I was exactly the type that would go out and shoot people, even though, it didn't appear that way. I got A's in all my classes. It wasn't like I was visibly, a troubled child or anything, but I really did not connect with people. I didn't love people. I didn't even like people. Most people were really not very nice to me, and I wasn't probably very nice to them, given who was indwelling me. But I talk about all this because it's very important to know who you're not or who you were as a sinner before you can ever know who you are. If you don't know that Satan was living in you and dwelling in you and expressing himself through you, you cannot know that Christ is living through you and in you and as you. And while I love the exchange life movement and people like Ian Thomas and others that wrote about Christ replacing our life, they didn't really get the dark side right. It was like, well, sin is a virus or a parasite within us or something, or a disease in us. And they never really saw that sin is the expression of the wrong spirit in us. Sin is a spirit. Sin is a person. Well, the same way that love is a person. Righteousness is a person. Louis was reading from Titus chapter 2. Grace appeared. Well, grace is a person. It's Jesus who appeared. It wasn't just a thing that appeared. A person appeared. Well, it's the same way with sin. Sin is a person, is a spirit. And I like to read a couple verses about that. Ephesians 2:1-3 talks about the sin as a spirit. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, who is Satan. And why he calls him the prince of the power of the air? Well, think about air for a moment. Air is universal and inescapable. You're breathing it in and out constantly. You never are independent of air. You have to have air to survive physically, and so you're in Satan like your spiritual atmosphere. And he calls him the prince of the power of the air, and he calls that air the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. Well, where is he working? In them, in the sons of disobedience. Romans chapter 8 talks about this spirit. He talked about I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. So he discovered, and it was revealed to him, that it was sin dwelling in him that was doing the sin, that it wasn't him at all. And that was a revelation to him as a believer that was still happening. Well, Romans 8:15 talks about what that sin was, because it was always a mystery to me. Well, they say sin is a principle in you. Sin is this thing in you, and I could never for the life of me, well, what is it? Where is it? Sort of like, I always think of the Folger, it was a Maxwell House coffee ad, and it was talking about Folger's crystals. What are those crystals anyway? What is that sin principle anyway? Well, Romans 8:15 talks about, for you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of sonship, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. And the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. Well, the Holy Spirit is a person. The Spirit bearing witness with our spirit is the person of God. Well, why is the spirit of slavery just a thing? It isn't. It's the Spirit now working in the children of within the children of disobedience. And in fact, we find the same connection of fear and death in Hebrews 2. It says in 2:14 and 15, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that he became a human being, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. Well, that's the spirit of slavery. The spirit of slavery is the devil. The devil, and it's not that the devil makes us do it. It's not that the devil possesses us. It's that we are willfully participating in the same nature that the devil has, the same spirit that he has and he chose to be at his fall. And so Adam and Eve, at their fall, chose to be what Satan was. Well, where does it say that in Genesis 3? So I like to turn to Genesis 3 and talk about what happened at the fall. And there's a lot of, I think, error about what is taught in Genesis 3. That, when Adam sinned, what happened is he got a corrupt human nature, or that something happened to his human nature. Well, something did. We became mortal. Our bodies became mortal. But it's not just about death. What about how did we become sinners? How did sin entered the world in Romans 5:12? It doesn't mean sin is somewhere floating around in the atmosphere. No, sin entered human beings. And it's the same language that would be used of a demon entering into a human being. Sin entered us, and we became its vessels, the spirit of sin, the spirit of slavery. And so in Genesis 3, now the serpent was more crafty or more cunning than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. Well, he was cunning because he wasn't just a serpent. He was far more than a serpent. He was an angelic being, one of the chief of the angels. It said, Ezekiel 28, you are in Eden, the garden of God. He said to the woman, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? See how he twists the words of God? He questions first that God ever said it, and then he makes it, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden. God is just so horrible that he doesn't even give you anything to eat, and he's going to say, you can't eat from any tree. And that's how Satan works. He tells you a partial truth, twists it into lies. He never just outright lies because he's never so obvious. He's cunning, he's crafty. And the woman corrects the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. Of course, God never said, don't touch it. He only said, don't eat of it. And so Eve isn't getting the words right. And so she's being led down the road of deception. But the serpent then outright lies because he's already got her half deceived already. The serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. In the Hebrew, that is, you will not die. It's to emphasize that you will die. And it's not really talking about physical death because the command was, in the day that you eat of this tree, you shall die. You shall surely die. Well, they didn't physically die, so it's not physical death. It's spirit death. It's dying to God is what's going to happen. They're going to be separated from their union, their unconfirmed union, because they had to confirm their union with a choice, the choice for God. So the union could be broken, and it was. So the serpent lies and says, you will surely not die. And humanity was deceived by the fact that they didn't immediately physically die. I'm not sure how much Adam and Eve really understood about spiritual death. But then Satan goes on, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, what Satan was saying was not entirely a lie, because God himself says that their eyes were opened and they knew good and evil. But they knew the wrong good and evil. They knew the self for self good and evil, judging good and evil in reference to themselves. Like in the book of Judges, the last verse, and all Israel did what was right in their own eyes. That's the false wisdom. When I don't rely on the spirit of wisdom, I rely on my own wisdom, which is really Satan's wisdom or the world's wisdom. So there's two wisdoms here. It's important to know that. And what they were imbibing was the false wisdom. You see, because the two trees, especially eating of the tree of knowledge, eating is union. You are what you eat, I was always told growing up. You unite yourself with it. It becomes part of you. And what were they eating? They weren't just eating a fig from the tree. They were eating the words of Satan. They were taking the words of Satan and believing them, taking them into themselves, and becoming one with his spirit. It doesn't have to say that in so many words. You become one with the one you believe. We become united with Christ by faith, by believing the promise of God in the gospel. We unite ourselves to Christ, or we become united with Christ. Well, in the same way, in the garden, they partook of the false communion. This is really communion in reverse. We partake of the body and blood of Christ through the elements, the bread and the wine, and we are celebrating our union with Christ. Well, in the garden, it was an anti-communion. They were becoming one with the wrong spirit by partaking and disobeying God with regard to the tree. So when they ate the fig, they were really consuming the devil's spirit, becoming one with the spirit of the evil one. And there are other verses in the Bible, in the New Testament, about, I already read John 8:44, you are of your father the devil. And he's talking to Jewish leaders here. You are of your father the devil, and his lusts you do. So their very desires originate from Satan. I read Ephesians 2:2. I could read 1 John 3:8, that the one who sins is of the devil. That is, and F.F. Bruce explained that what that means is the one who sins has their spiritual source in the devil. Wow. We don't, when I was in seminary and I was testing out the truth of what Norman said, searching the scriptures myself, one of the things that I noticed in reading systematic theologies of all these evangelical theologians was that they talk for 100 pages on the doctrine of sin, and then maybe 3/4 of a page on Satan and his angels, and they would never mention passages like John 8:44, Ephesians 2, 1 John 3:8, and Satan's relationship to sin. And it's like precisely the scriptures that Norman was talking about. Precisely what, when I first heard Norman talk about, sin is Satan dwelling in us, expressing his nature and his lust through us. It's like, that just fit the image God gave me before I was really fully saved. It was that I was chained to the devil. It's like, oh, wow, somebody's finally saying what was my experience. It was like, and I was amazed that other Christians, the stumbling block for them with Norman's message wasn't Christ in them. It's that Satan was in us. They didn't want to believe that. They'd rather believe it was just themselves. And it's like, to me, it was knowing that I was not in control, and it wasn't just my human nature or human self that was bad, meant I could be delivered, that I could be delivered from the evil one. And I knew at some level that it was the cross, although I didn't really know yet how. And when I first read Norman, when I was in high school, my neighbor that had sent over that Catholic charismatic book, she was the one who gave me tapes of Malcolm Smith, who'd been taught by Norman Grubb, gave me some of Norman Grubb's books, The Spontaneous You, The Law of Faith, God Unlimited. And I didn't understand them, but I knew that the teaching, Christ was in me, and this was the solution. This was the deliverance. And, and it's like the possibility that I might not be this horrible, shameful person, but actually that I could be an expression of Christ in my form. It was like a truth too wonderful to grasp. And it was like entering a room where you've been in darkness and you go in and you're squinting your eyes because the light is so bright. And so I knew I knew, even though it wasn't yet my experience, I had an inner knowing, okay, this is the truth that I need to understand. And the funny thing is that my neighbor didn't stay with Norman Grubb's teaching. Actually, I think she might think they're heretical now. But it's like she probably regrets to this day ever giving me those books and tapes. But still, it was, to go back to Genesis 3, what Adam and Eve did was they received that false, wrong spirit of error into themselves, and they became participants in the satanic deity nature. They had been participants in the divine nature. That's what Peter calls us, 2 Peter 1:4, where we are partakers of the divine nature, and then discusses how to add to ourselves love and goodness and all the fruits of the Spirit. Well, how do you add those to yourself? You add them by believing the truth about yourself, that those things are already within you because that's his nature. You're just participating in a nature that is not your own. Whether you're a sinner or you're a saint, you're participating in the nature of another. There isn't any just you. There's no just human nature that is bad or is good. We participate in the nature of the one that is within us. Now, that's not possession. We're not possessed by Satan, that Satan just makes us do what he wants, and we can't, no, because we still have that choice to respond to God when God calls us in the gospel. And God was calling me all through my life, and I can respond to him. So, you see, because I have that freedom to respond to God, Satan's control over me is not absolute. There's still that freedom. Now, Christians do make the false assumption that freedom of choice means I have the freedom to control my actions. No, we don't. We do not control our actions, at least not directly. We never have that. That's what Romans 7 teaches. We try to do what is good out of self-effort, or we try to avoid evil, and we find evil is right there with me, and it's no longer we who do it, but the sin dwelling in our members that's doing it. We're not in control of our behavior. What we have the freedom to do is to respond to God when he calls us from within or through the gospel. That's the freedom. And then everything is decided by that choice. And we make that choice repeatedly through our lives, but especially when we receive Christ as our Savior. That I knew that Christ came within and Satan went out. And when I read that in Norman, it's like I went to church. This was in 10th grade. I made a huge placard, and I wrote it in big letters, "No vacancy for Satan," on both sides. And I went into church, and I made a fool of myself because I was just so happy that I had discovered this, or rather God had shown it to me, that I didn't really care what people thought. And people were asking me what that meant, and that was my way of demonstrating it. I don't think I fully understood it, but I think God honored it. God honors that kind of bold taking of his word. That if you have to hide it, it was always in church. The invitation to receive Christ was always with every head bow and every eye closed. If you want to receive Christ, raise your hand. And it's like, well, if it isn't public and nobody can see it, how is it real? I mean, okay, I understand making an invitation. Okay, maybe you feel embarrassed and you want to talk with someone about receiving Christ, raise your hand and no one will know. But it has to be public. That's why baptism is a public event. It's for every eye to see and to behold. And you are saying, I don't care what anybody else thinks or the opinions of men or of the world. I am receiving Christ. And so that's why God honors that kind of foolishness, is because it's I'm choosing. This is what I'm choosing. Anyway, to go back to Genesis 3, And the woman, verse 6, saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desired to make one wise. And she took of its fruit and ate. And what we have here are the three things 1 John 2 talks about. The lust of the flesh. The tree was good for food. Lust of the flesh isn't just sexual desire, desire for food. And the devil had tricked her. Oh, God may have made it so you couldn't eat of any tree of the garden. And so, well, we need to eat, so the tree is good for food. Then it was a delight to the eyes, the lust of the eyes. We all want beautiful things, a great car, a great house, and nice possessions, beautiful things. And so he deceives us through the flesh, through the outward appearance of things. And not that there's anything wrong with any of those things. A beautiful car or a beautiful house and possessions are all nice things. There's nothing wrong with them. And there was nothing wrong with any of the trees in the garden except for the one that God forbade. And then the tree was to be desired to make one wise. Well, what Eve didn't realize is the wisdom of God was in a way already available if she ate of the tree of life. That wasn't forbidden to her, but she didn't eat of the tree of life. She believed Satan had taken Satan's spirit into herself, and so she ate, and she gave some to her husband, and he also ate. And so humanity fell, and we became expressors of that wrong spirit ever since. And of course, what does that mean to be expressors of the wrong spirit? We took into ourselves that covetousness, that absolutely inability to be satiated, where nothing is ever enough. If we have something, we want more and more. My older brother loves antique British cars, particularly one called Rovers. And he has, it wasn't that one or two was enough. He had to have the best collection of Rovers in the world. And he probably does. He has a collection worth several $1 million, one of which belonged to the British consul in Hong Kong while it was owned by the British. It's worth a lot of money and is very impressive. And look what a great self I am because I have this great collection of cars. But we all do that in our own way. Look how smart I am. I could be boasting, well, I went and I got 2 master's degrees and a PhD. Look how great I am. Or someone's a great electrician or a plumber and really is very successful and earning a lot of money. Look at the house I have. Look at the possessions I have. And it's all just Satan. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, just in a more limited fashion. We might not be king of the mountain. We might not be king of the ocean, but we're king of the goldfish pond that we're in. But we want to feel that way. We want to feel, I think there's a song, I just want to be somebody. That's that illusion. No, we don't get to be somebody. We're vessels. We're containers who are perfect nothing to contain the perfect all. And so one of the effects immediately after Adam and Eve fell, the eyes of both were opened. They really did begin to see because they were seeing with the mind of Satan. And so they were seeing in a way they never saw before. They did become wise, just wise with the wrong wisdom. The mind of the flesh, Paul later calls it in Romans 8. And they knew that they were naked. Well, they were naked of the glory of God that once clothed them. It says that all have sinned, and most translations have fall short of the glory of God. I believe it should be all have sinned and lack the glory of God. They lost the glory of the divine presence, of the Spirit within, the presence of the true wisdom within that would have guided them through every circumstance. And so they knew they had lost something, that they were naked and exposed. And you think about it. I had many dreams growing up, especially before I was saved, of how suddenly I was in school and I didn't have any clothes on. I don't know if others of you have had that dream where you're just exposed and you really are this puny, insignificant person that you're afraid of being in public, whether it's not being strong enough, not being smart enough, not being anything enough, and it's publicly exposed. And it's that fear, that spirit of fear that Satan fills us with. And that leads to more covetousness because we want to cover that up immediately, as Adam and Eve did, covering themselves with the fig leaves in the garden, probably from the tree of knowledge itself. And they hide themselves from the presence of the Lord. And the reason why they hide themselves is because they're ashamed. So there's a shame that comes upon them, a self-hatred. They're ashamed of being the weak vessels that God created them to be and to express himself through. But it's by God's design that we feel shame. It's called a sin consciousness. And God means for us to have that. He means for us to go through that, because to be ashamed means I want something to change. And there's the hope of repentance, of turning back to God because of that consciousness of sin. So yes, it does come from Satan, but God uses Satan against himself. And so that consciousness of sin and shame and of nakedness, we know that in our hearts that we're not enough. And we can't ever be what we want to be. And that ultimately will bring us to repentance, because God subjected the creation to futility in Romans 8 and to vanity. And we are vain, futile creatures when we were sinners. That is what we are. We need to know that. So sin consciousness isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. So we have two major effects of the fall, other than physical death, which to me is the least important of the effects. The two effects are, first, that the spirit of Satan entered into us and we became joined to that spirit, the false spirit, who now expresses himself through us, and we have a sin consciousness, a consciousness of being wrong at our core. And we have to know both those things before we can ever be delivered from them. And so the next time I'm going to talk about how we're delivered, and I'll go through the egg in the bag and the 3 jars and the sponge, and to show us how God delivers us through his blood and through the body, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So.